Welcome to the Crit House, everybody. We're back on with the five, and today we have Edward Boches from Boston, who is a documentary photographer, a journalist, a street photographer, and he is the man of a million projects. Edward, it's great to have you with us here on the Crit House, and thanks for picking five images. It's a fascinating conversation we've been having with a lot of different photo people. Tell us about what you went through in selecting the images, and maybe a little bit about the process, because that's a fascinating thing for me. Like trying to edit down to just five images. Like, how do you do that? It's a real challenge.
Sure. I would like to just actually start by saying it's great to be back, and I want to thank you and congratulate you for keeping the Crit House going, and for some of the successes so far, and also for all the support and encouragement that it's giving to the photographic community. I think what you're doing is really important for a lot of us. So thank you for that.
Oh, sure.
So I think the email that I first got from you basically said, pick five images that you can't get out of your mind, and on any given day that would be five different photographs. So I started to really think about what makes the images that I remember memorable to me. And in every case, it's been because they either had some important impact on my life, or they really affected the way that I thought about the world around me, causes, communication, social justice, etc. And every one of them I picked more for their, in some ways, historical significance, or the emotional power they had over me personally, including particular memories, less because of what we would consider the characteristics or the virtues that make it a good photograph. I think they're all powerful photographs. I think they all have emotional and historical stories behind them. I don't think they're the kind of photographs that we would ever call, nor would I think the photographers who took them would call them art. They're really more documentary, photojournalism, and communication, if you will. In some way or another, almost all of them affected or influenced, beliefs and opinions and perspectives about life and people.
Well, these are certainly images that have had their impact on the world and how things have gone. Let's take a look.
So this is one of the most, obviously one of the famous photographs of the 21st century, taken by a student named John Philo. He was a photojournalism major at Kent State. I was a sophomore in high school when this happened, and when I saw this photograph, and it's no exaggeration to say that if it didn't change my life, it really influenced it. This was the beginning of me learning to distrust a government that I, grew up believing in. And it was the idea that, oh my God, my own government can shoot us. And this was done at the protests at Kent State. The National Guard had been sent in. Students had taken over the ROTC building, and they just opened fire on innocent kids. And the story behind the photograph, is as important as the photograph, obviously. So this girl, Marianne Vecchio, 14 years old, and she was basically, a kid who was hitchhiking across the country. She is standing over the body of a student named Jeffrey Miller. She'd met him maybe 10 or 15 minutes before. They were talking, and he was shot. And the interesting thing about the photographer, John, was not covering this event because he was editing, and he was gathering everybody else's photographs. But he walked out at lunchtime, and as he approached the scene, guardsmen opened fire on him, among other people, and he hit the ground. Tree bark all around him was spraying off the trees, and when the shooting stopped, he got up and was surprised he was alive and hadn't been shot. He'd taken a few photographs before this moment, before he went down. And when he got up, he turned and saw this. He knew the kid was dead, that Jeffrey was dead. Marianne wasn't sure. He took this photograph. It was the last shot on the roll of film in his camera. And I think the next day, there was nobody in America who didn't see this photograph. So this is when I decided, I was struggling between whether I'd be a journalism major or a film major. But this sort of solidified my going to journalism school.
Yeah, I mean, what an impact this had on the world after it was taken. So great. Thank you for that. Number 2.
Yeah, so here's another equally important photograph from that time period, by a photographer, 27-year-old photographer named Nick Ut, who was a Vietnamese American photojournalist in Vietnam. This was after napalm dropping in, I forget what village. And kids and families are running with the skin coming off their bodies from being burnt. And he got this photograph, and it was just sort of, it may have been the photograph that really brought the war to an end. And it and you know, came right around the same time they were getting rid of the draft. Yeah, I think this was also controversial in a lot of ways. AP was not going to run it because of the frontal nudity, and the Associated Press person in Hanoi argued vehemently, and then they finally agreed. And again, same thing. This was Time magazine, Look, Life magazine. I mean, this was everywhere. And I remember these two photographs not from having studied photography, but having seen them, you know, when I was 16 years old and 18
Same.
years old.
Yep.
As you can imagine, the impact on someone that age who is thinking about the war and the fear of being drafted, obviously, is a, you know, lasting impact and memories. There's another interesting thing. A lot of versions of the photograph you've seen, including the first one that ran, did not have the Army photographer on the right in the picture. He'd been cropped out. And it's questionable as to whether he was cropped out in order to bring more emphasis to the girl running. I forget her name. She's still alive, I believe. And Nick actually saved her after he took the picture. But it was questionable as to whether his indifference, it would have been perceived as indifference on the part of a U.S. military person. And maybe that was why it was cropped out, but who really knows? But this is the actual photograph as it was intended to be seen and run.
Yeah, just moving every time you see it. And I tell you, I say what I'm finding this as I do more of these 5, and I spend time with the images up on screen as you and other photographers are talking about them. You just start to see more in them where you just focus on the images. And I don't know why I'm focusing on it, but it's the first time I've ever noticed that she's stepping through in a pothole. It's like the only pothole, and that's where her foot is stepping. I know that doesn't mean anything, but
I know, and the line coming forward, the pool of water coming forward into the out of frame. But you know, the other thing is, this is a day when, I mean, you know, obviously no web, no internet, no social media. A single image could have an impact, you know, on the entire world in a matter of hours. And I mean, those days are long gone. I mean, maybe images from 9/11 or the January 6th storming the Capitol, you know, George Floyd. If there are very few images anymore where a single photograph can have this kind of power, but there was a time, you know, when it could, and it did on a semi-regular basis.
We are in a different age. Speaking of which, you're number 3.
So this is a Dorothea Lange book, not her photograph, not her most famous migrant mother, of course. This was from a slightly different time period, a little bit later after the FSA. She was doing work for the Bureau of Agricultural Economics, and this was a migrant cotton worker in Arizona. And as she typically did, she cropped, you know, quite a bit to put the emphasis on that calloused, wrinkled, you know, worn hand. But the reason that I picked this photograph is the very first book of photography I ever owned was a gift from my girlfriend in college, and it was this aperture book of Dorothea Lange photographs. And this had always struck me that the power of a single face, even though it's half obscured, could convey so much emotion and tell such a complete story, even though there was so little else in the picture. I mean, this is a guy working 10-hour days for, you know, $2 in the hot sun, and you know, barely getting by, and it was sort of another you know, tragedy about America that interestingly, none of these first 3 photographs had subjects where I learned very much about them in school. It was through photography or from media or from journalists who had the courage to tell these stories.
I have to say I had never seen this image before. I was glad you put it up there and glad you talked about it. So thanks for sharing that. And this is fantastic. One of my favorites.
Marianne Marx, who
One of the greats.
is my all-time favorite photographer. And
good choice.
And I know probably everybody knows the Tiny work over 40 years of photographing Tiny, but if anyone's ever seen the complete works in the three big books that are published a few years ago, it's unbelievable the volumes of stuff that she's done. And what I've always loved about all of her work, I mean, I could have picked just my 5 photographs from Marianne Marx, is that she had so much respect for her subjects, and she had such an ability to earn their trust, and she never judged them ever and looked down on them, even if they were disenfranchised communities that she photographed. It didn't matter if they were prostitutes or troubled children or drug addicts or whatever. She just treated them with the utmost respect and told the truth about them. And that to me is really just evident in this photograph, besides the story that it tells about Amanda, who at 9 years old, not only is smoking a cigarette, but is smoking it as if she is an adult. The posture, the poise, the way she's holding the cigarette, inhaling and blowing it out. I mean, it's it's a story that only a photographer would go to these kinds of places and embed in these kinds of communities could ever tell. And she herself had been like a bit of an outcast and had a tough upbringing, but she came from she was a privileged photographer working for Life magazine. One of my favorite stories is she went and photographed some elderly Kentucky coal miners in this cabin where they were living in old age. And when you walked in, it smelled of feces and urine and old garbage, and it was completely and totally disgusting, say by modern, westernized standards. Her assistant threw up 2 times and had to leave the room and go throw up in the bathroom, which infuriated Marianne Marx, who would never, ever show in any way that the environment that she was in or the people she was with had anything to ever be ashamed of. And when that happened, she just instantly struck up a conversation about the quilt on the bed and the colors in it and whether how long the woman had taken to sew it, and this whole kind of thing that just was the epitome of lessons in how to be interested in people. Because I think one of the things we learn as documentary photographers, when you're interested in someone genuinely, then that's the beginning of earning the trust that lets you take these kinds of photographs.
That's a great story. And I will say that that story could be told, or that attitude is one that you have, I believe, with the subjects that you take pictures of.
No,
it's true. It's true. I mean, I know you well enough to be able to know that you have a lot of respect for the people that you work with, and I know that you communicate in a way that engages them and is respectful. So, number 5.
Yeah. So this is a Larry Fink photograph, and I actually never knew who Larry Fink was until I was well into a boxing project that I was doing on amateur boxers, and another photographer, Michael Hintlian, told me I should take a look at Larry Fink's boxing work, which I found incredibly informing and helpful as I did that project. But then I fell in love with all of his work, and I started just to devour it. And this was Pat's 12th birthday. I'm assuming that Pat is the kid receiving the piece of cake, and he did a series on this family over years. I think they were on an adjoining piece of property to a farm that he lives on in Pennsylvania. And the reason that I picked this is because I spent a lot of time studying this photograph during a time when I was trying to improve my own work, think about the frame, think about edges, think about what is outside the picture as well as that was inside the photograph. And it was just a moment when I was thinking about that kind of those kinds of characteristics of an image that I came upon this, and I was completely and totally blown away, because you could look at this for an hour or more. You've got so many things happening, right? There's the the mother serving the cake. Then you've got someone, behind against the wall watching, the little kid watching. There's an ashtray coming in from the right. There's the hand pouring the Fanta. There's the girl who's cut in half. Who is she looking at? Probably the person pouring the Shasta or whatever it is. And it's like, it's crazy. There is so much. So I actually wrote, I don't know, it's probably a 1,500 word piece on all the things that are working in this photograph that make it so complex. And you said earlier that, sometimes you can look at a photograph like the Napalm Girl and you see something you've never seen before. At the same time, there are some photographs where you look at them once and they may be powerful and have impact, but there's what you see is what you see, and that's it. But this photograph just keeps going.
Yeah,
so
it does.
So I picked it for a very different reason, but I think at the same time, it represents his ability to connect with, with people who may not be from the exact same walk of life he is, and tell their story.
Yeah, brilliant. And there is definitely a thread. There is a line that connects all of the 5 images that you have provided to us. Edward Boches, thank you so much for showing us your 5 images here on the Crit House. Brilliant stuff, and it's always good talking to you.
Hey, Jeff, good talking to you, and thanks for having me. And now I'm going to have to go back up and watch more of these that I may have to see what everybody else's 5 photographs are.
Thanks, everybody, for watching the 5 on the Crit House.